to the Core Connections podcast. I'm your host, Erica Zeal, and today's quote of the day is, "Birth is one of the most powerful experiences we'll ever know as humans." Thank you, Jaime Fleres, who is our guest today on the Core Connections podcast. So welcome, Jaime.
Thank you so much.
Yes. Well, I'm going to give you a proper introduction. Jaime is a mother. She is an author, a writing coach, editor, English professor, doula, and embodied movement teacher. So I'm so excited to have you here today so we can
I always used it that way. And then when I got into college, I really loved writing, even though it didn't come easily. You know, it was like hard to write academic papers, but it was such good practice for me to kind of really get my thoughts in order and just learn the craft of writing. Well, school was great. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was surprised to hear you say that writing was challenging for you as someone who likes to write. So was it the more academic side that was hard, and you're like the creative writer? Is that where you kind of started?
Well, I started with creative writing, but I actually, I was a professor for many years and I taught writing too. So I've just never, writing's one of those really dynamic elements of my life where it's never really come easily. It's always been something that I've learned to dance with. Okay. And I think that's why I'm so passionate about it, is that I can understand, it would be hard for me, I think, to relate to other writers if I was just like, hey, it's super easy for me and I don't ever struggle and I don't ever have resistance, but I really can deeply relate to the experience of that dynamic relationship with writing. And so I think it makes me a better teacher of writing and a better coach of writing to know that from the inside too.
Oh, I love to hear that. That makes me feel better because I feel like I write so much now with what I do, and growing up writing, I struggled with writing, and it is something like as an adult, if you'd have said to me when I was in high school, Erica, you're going to spend a lot of time writing with what you do down the road, I've been like, you got to be kidding me. Yeah, but you have to just learn. I've become such a better writer. I'm nowhere near your level of writing, but I think it's so fascinating what you do. So.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Anything like that, it's just that it takes practice and to develop the skills and the confidence around those skills,
Okay. I want to dive into your book today because I have a lot of women that, listen to everything that I talk about, as well as I'm sure there's some men here and there. And that is, I'm going to hold it up so we get the video up, is about birthing your story. And so before we dive in too deep, I don't want to scare anybody off because I think it's so powerful. When I read your book, Jaime, I first initially, when you posted about, some having people read it, and I was like, oh, that sounds really neat. It'd be really amazing for my audience of women. And let me just tell you, I was beyond blown away at how it moved me. I wasn't expecting that at all. I really was like, okay, it's about how, to write your birth story. And I was like, well, that's a neat idea, right? People do that. And I was like, okay. And then as I dove in and read it, I was like, literally experience all these emotions. You totally brought me to tears sometimes. And I know everyone listening is like, wait, about writing your birth story. So I would love you to just, you're the expert in this. Would you talk a little bit more, one, about who this is for right off the bat? Because it's not just for moms that just had a baby.
Right. Yeah, so the book is about writing your birth story. And so people sometimes get a little confused. Like, does it mean like my own birth, like when I was born, or does it mean like my children's birth? And so the book is really focused on like your giving birth, like if you're a woman having given birth to your children, or it's also for fathers and partners. And so it's witnessing the birth of your child. So just to clarify that, that's kind of the realm in which we're working. And yeah, so writing your birth story, who it's for, yes, like you said, a lot of people think like, oh, that's something you might do in the postpartum, like in the first 6 months of baby's life. But really, it's for anybody who's experienced birth, really. It could be a person who's experienced birth loss. It can be a person who's had an experience of adoption. It can be an experience of surrogacy. And then as far as, men and women, we think like, oh, the mom would write the story, but actually men have quite a profound experience in birth and then also in birth story writing. We can get into some of the benefits of having papas write their stories to our partners. And then there's the other issue of like, do we write it right away? Like, when is it too late? Like, is there a window of time in which to write your story? And have really found through my experience that we can have a profound experience writing our birth story like 2 days postpartum, and we can have a very profound experience, equally but different, very different experience writing maybe up to 30 or 50 years after giving birth. That, and I'm sure you saw that in the book.
Yeah, I did. And so perspective, I don't know, that's just a big word. I wrote that down in writing some things I wanted to have us talk about, because perspective, and this can apply to so many things, but especially to a birth experience, really any experience in life, but the perspective and just birth, for example, how obviously the woman giving birth and then their partner or someone else that's in that scenario with them, and how it could be perceived completely different by different people.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, just to that point, I always say, like, just because we have an experience with somebody doesn't mean, just because we're in the same room and something's happening doesn't mean we're having the same experience. And I think especially in birth, given the fact that, the conditions around each member of that team, including the birthing mother and even the baby, they're all having really unique experiences. Mama's in her body and she's in this like primal kind of otherworldly realm, oftentimes. And then she's got her own set of conditions of like really surrendering and having this physical experience and all of this. And then, maybe papa or partners in the room, and they're not in their bodies. They're much more in their minds, and they're, how do I support, and what am I doing, and how do I navigate this environment, and how do I like just witness what's happening right now and not be able to control it. And then you have the birth professional who's there monitoring like health and well-being of everybody. And so everybody's having a really unique experience. And we can talk about that, but when we write about it, we gain more insight into the inner landscape, like what's happening on the inside of everybody, so that we can really understand what it was like for everybody else.
Right. And I love that I was so moved at how powerful it was and is to write. I've definitely talked about my births, and to what you had said a little bit ago, like when you first initially, in like those initial days after giving birth, I can see how down the road, because my oldest now is 11, and I look back at that, and I think as more time goes, you gain more knowledge. So you can look back with a totally different perspective now than say I would have when my oldest was born, 11 years ago. Do you have anything else to add to that about the writing and when to do it? Is there a best time that you recommend, or any recommendations on that?
Well, I would say I definitely think there's that perspective, and that our story actually is never static. None of our stories in life are static. They're constantly changing and shifting as we change our perspective and where we are in life and our relationship to that event and all of that. And so it does change. And I think what's so powerful with that perspective, like you mentioned, is that we when we look back, we notice and we learn a lot from our experience. It's like there's like these hidden kind of jewels there that we get to like kind of dig around for and find, and undoubtedly we find something that we didn't quite know or see in that same way before writing. And so there's always this really cool thing that happens. I say in the book, we think that we're going to write just to document what happens, but we really discover something as we write. We discover something new about ourselves or about our experience or about something in our environment. Like we learn something new. So as far as the right times, I mean, in an ideal world, I would say it would be cool to write, as you're called, like through time, like that would be great because it's a process. I really talk about writing as a process, and that's obviously the ideal. But I would say the best time to do it is when you're feeling called to, and, in this moment, wherever you are in your birthing journey,
I love that. Okay, so to add to that, can we talk about expectations? And you're a mom as well. So
Mhm.
and as a birth doula, you've worked with a lot of women in the birthing aspect. I worked with a lot of women from the fitness, preparing them for the birth and the postpartum recovery and the core training and all of that. That I feel like women, especially more and more with all the information that's out there, right? There's this expectation that's put
Mhm.
upon women and also their spouses and how things are supposed to go, like, just so. This was a big thing I really want to talk about with you today, just to
Yeah.
because and this is where I felt so called to, like, we have to talk about this, and I want everyone to know about your book and really understanding how powerful it can be to write about your birth story. And it's not about the story itself necessarily, like the events. It's like how it's perceived, it's the expectations. It's helping also, I feel like it could really help someone work through if there's some judgment and expectations that weren't met or something like that. I can see how that can be so powerful with that.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And as you, I'm sure, remember, there's a chapter in the book about the cultural narrative, which is like the larger story that we've consumed about what birth is like and how we're supposed to navigate it and what it's supposed to look like and how that can really powerfully shape how we experience birth. And so there's that piece, which is also in the book. And in the book, I really have us just really look at that and become aware of like what were the factors that were shaping my perception of birth and pregnancy and motherhood that really affected my experience. So just using it as like information. And then just to speak on this topic more generally, what I would say is absolutely we have this kind of myth in our culture that we can sort of like plan everything, and if we just get the right book and we read the right thing and we have the right care professionals, like we're good, like we're solid. And that's really sweet, and that's just really understandable that we would have that desire to do that. But birth is one of those things. It's this wild creative process that's like unruly. It does not wish to be bound by our ideas of what it's going to be like. And so birth really calls us on this deep journey to an initiation, really, as I see it, to surrender. And birth may go just the way we want it, and it may not. And that has nothing to do with whether we're good enough or whether we did the right things. It's really just the nature of this experience that we're called to surrender. And I think that birthing women aren't given that perspective as often as they should, that we can plan and we should absolutely set up support for ourselves, because that's so important in birth, is to have the right support. But at the same time, there's this element of mystery that's going to come in, and our dance will be, how do we navigate like what actually happens. And so with that, one of the great things about birth story writing is that we may not have been in control of our experiences during birth, but we're absolutely in control of how we tell our story. And so writing our story can be a real reclamation for us, a real ownership of like, this is what happened to me, and I get to decide how I'm relating to it and what it means to me.
And how a woman feels about it. And I think it from an emotional perspective, there's so much, and there's that flood of hormones and all of that. So that's where I can see, even a woman and her partner sitting down in those, that time soon postpartum, especially if she feels like she's going through all of this crazy changes with the hormones and all of that. And even maybe it's one of those things, just because this is common, it comes up a lot, is a woman who ends up with a cesarean birth that didn't plan for it. I know a lot
Mm-hmm.
of women can have kind of like, oh, if only I'd done this or whatever it was. But it's like, well, let's look at it as like being grateful that a woman can have a cesarean birth so that both her and baby are safe and healthy. So I don't know, I
Right.
just see it as a way to, so much of, what we do in life, right, is perspective and how we're looking at it. And then there's this gratitude piece. And I love that you also mentioned that as well, because being grateful for our experiences, even if they didn't go as planned, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there may be some looking back as in like, oh, I wish, again, it would have gone this way, that way, whatever. So I don't know, from my perspective, again, with the writing, and this can really apply to any scenario. It doesn't have to be just about the birth and all of that. Is that it can really help someone process the emotions and event that they've gone through.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, thank you so much for saying that. And I think, yeah, there's a lot there, and that's a lot of what I talk about in the book too. Is that, and I think there is this important piece. You're saying gratitude, and I think in the book I call it honoring. And so for me, it's like we don't, my message there is we don't always get to celebrate our births. Like, wow, I'm just so celebrating that I had an emergency C-section. Like, we may never get to celebration, but we can get to honoring, and that's just having like this deep reverence and respect for ourselves and what we've been through and how things actually were. This is like a kind of a radical acceptance of how it went, but going backwards to processing, because we need to get there, right? We can't just say that we're there. Like, oh, I feel great that baby's healthy and I'm healthy and here we are. Like, that there are real true emotions to grapple with there, that are really important and really valuable and really valid. And so with writing, we get this container, this really safe container in which to explore that for ourselves. And it's different than speaking, because if we're speaking with somebody, we have an audience, right? We're worrying, like, are they going to really hear me? Do they want to hear this? How are they going to react? Does somebody really want to sit with me in my grief right now, or my real struggle with like feeling about my body this way or feeling about my birth this way? We get to have space in writing where we really just get to make it our own, and we get to say what's true. Like, I'm really feeling grief right now, and this is my experience, and this is what's really getting me, and these are the moments in my birth that I'm just really still struggling with, that feel really challenged. And we get space to do that. And then not only do we get to process it, but something about writing creates a witness outside of ourselves. And so we get to see that thing, that experience that's inside of us, outside of us. And so it gives us some space, some distance, and we can start to change our relationship and become the authors of our story, rather than just feeling like it's this thing that is in control. It's like, wow, no, I actually get to start responding and relating to this story.
I love that. And so it helps to flip that, and that you then have the control. And again, this can apply to anything in life, I feel like, right? I want to dive in and talk a little bit more about you and helping others write, because I think that's so, I love your book. So I'm going to hold it up one more time. So Birth Your Story. Will you just tell everybody quick where they can find this at?
Yeah, so it's Birth Your Story, why writing about your birth matters. And you can find it on Amazon, other major retailers. It's in ebook and paperback. And then it's also on my website, which is jaimefleres.com. It's JAIMEFLERES.com.
Okay, perfect. And we will put that in the show notes as well, once this is all up and live. So Jaime, I want to talk a little bit more about writing and, writing a book. I know you do a lot of editing. You help people to, I guess kind of birth their book.
Yeah, that's what we call it.
That's what you do. I was like, I love that. So like, how do you go about doing that? Because I feel like I have a lot of people that have asked about, like, I've written a book, I self-published. It was one of the hardest things I ever did, except for birthing a child. That's what I say. It was writing.
I wrote that very same thing this week. So I get it.
It was, and because writing, again, for me, like, I can talk all day long and do videos and movement and do this and that. And so it was, it was a very good challenge. It made me really, be like, oh, I've got to get better at writing skills. And so I think it's just that propelling us and always learning, right? But when you work with someone to get them to start, writing a book, like, what is your initial advice that you give someone in, how do you start? Like, if you're kind of like, oh, I've got this idea and I want to write about this, but, maybe there's like notes galore. Like, I look at my stuff and I've got so much stuff. I could put together a book today, but it would be so unorganized unless I take a step back and be like, what do I want it to,
Yes. Yeah, I work with authors at different phases. And so the program I love, this is perfect marriage, because I bring a lot of my like doula and birth work into my writing coaching work. So like my program is 9 months long, because I feel like that's like a really important gestation period for a major creation. And so it's 9 months. And so we spend the first 3 months in like foundation, which is like what happens in birth too. It's like putting all the parts, like creating all the parts. And so the first thing I do with authors is that we get into the mindset. Like, we really look at mindset, and we look at like, what does it take to be a creative, like mentally? We already have that creative capacity, but how do we like remove the obstacles to that creativity, really step into that space, because it's scary space, right? So we also look at the inner critic. We do some of that work. Like, what is the thing inside that's giving us resistance. So in some ways, I feel like my job is like a creativity and a resistance coach. Like, how do we work with resistance when it shows up? How do we really amp up your creativity? So that's a big piece. So there's that piece that happens that's really just kind of getting us like aligned and like ready to be a channel for this book to come in, like, okay, I'm ready. I've got this, I'm feeling, so we work on the confidence and the understanding that like, okay, this is what it feels like to write a book. We're also kind of going on a wild adventure. So we may not know exactly what it's going to look like, but we're ready. Like, we know what to do when like the monster pops out of the bush. Like, oh, I see you. I planned for you, like, we're going to keep going. So there's that piece. And then because I've been a professor for a long time, I have a lot of tools in writing. So like, how do we look at like our subjects? So we really look at like, how do we take our ideas and hone them down into a potent idea that's workable for a book that not only really serves our mission, but also will serve an audience. And so we look at that. So we look at how to get to the idea and how to really shape it. And then we also look at things like the context. So we look at the audience, like, who are you writing to? We look at the author, like, who are you to write this book? What are you bringing to the table? Why you? Why now? We really, really just start to like, again, it's like that foundation building where we really set like a solid container where you're clear about what you're doing, who you're doing it for, what it's going to look like, and how we're, and begin to start shaping and organizing it. We also look at like the intentions, like, why are we writing this book? And then how are we going to do it so that it works with our lives? Because we're all really busy professionals and we have kids and we have the things that we love. And so how do we make a doable plan? Like, how do we actually make writing feel good? Because we have this old program from school that like writing is hard and we have to like really grind for it, And so it's like, how do we actually make writing feel really good for us? And like, we're really enjoying the creative process. It doesn't mean that it will be easy, but that we can actually like feel like we're in right relationship to it so that it works for us too.
I love that. Yeah, we are all so busy, and writing a book sounds a little daunting, But okay, so I have a question. So, I think a lot of people think like you have to be, already have a big presence and all that to write a book. What do you say to that? Do you know what I mean? Like, so if there's someone out there that's like thinking like they're an expert and say something in their wheelhouse, but they don't have an online presence and things like that to get started.
Yeah. Well, I will say this, and this actually dropped in really clearly for me recently because, I talk about like experts write books, like all the experts we know, most of them have written a book. But the other thing that's true is that we become experts by writing books. Mm-hmm. So if I would have just taught this material, the material that's in my book, if I would have just taught it in a workshop or just taught it as an online course, I would not have developed the depth of knowledge and understanding of this body of work if it wasn't for the book writing process. So there was something about the book writing process that really developed my understanding because I sat and worked with it for a few years, really, really deepening my understanding of like, what is this all about? So I created expertise by writing the book. I feel clear. I could talk about it. I know it in my sleep. I can tell you about the book, and all the wisdom that it contains,
Okay, that's a neat way to look at it. I've never heard anyone approach it that way, and I think that's really, really fascinating because I think so many, and I know like as an entrepreneur, and yes, I've written a book. Mine was, for specifically prenatal exercise. Someday I will write something else. It's in my to-do over here, my list of to-dos. But again, it's that like kind of when do you start and how do you put it in? But for those that I feel like are like, oh well, I've got to wait, to dive in and do whatever that next thing is. And sometimes I feel that so many tend to just wait. Like you can't wait for the perfect moment to do whatever it is. Like you have to take that first leap to dive in, whether it's writing a book or starting a business or having another baby. I don't know. Do you know what I mean? Everyone, this conversation comes up like, well, when is the right time to have another baby? I'm like, I don't know. You just do it because there's never really a right time. And it's the same thing with writing a book or doing whatever it is like if you always wait till that perfect moment to do whatever that thing is you really want to do, you just kind of keep pushing it off because you're like, life is busy and, this and that and whatever. And then you just don't do it. So how do you fit that into your life? Like, do you have some tips for like, do you block off, a little bit of time each day, or how do you go about? And I know everybody works in different creative modes. For me, sometimes I'm like, I have to have like 4 hour stretches of zero interruption, which is like, I feel like nearly impossible in my life with 3 children, but it can happen. I just have to like schedule it and make it happen.
Yeah. Yeah, I do wish that I had like one easy formula, and I do find that in conversation with people, they're like, "Can you just give me the formula? Like, what's the secret?" And I'm like, "Well, the secret is you just keep showing up. I mean, that's the secret.
Okay.
Is you just decide to show up. Getting started, just showing up is often the hardest part, isn't it? Whether we're working out or whatever it is. So I think that's a really important piece. Some of the things I do with people when they're in resistance is like, if you're not ready to write, like talk about why you're not ready to write. Like, what is that about? So if you're like, gosh, I am really clear that I want to write this book, but I'm having all this resistance, like write about your resistance. I call it like circling. It's like you're kind of circling the thing, before you actually get there. And so you write about that and you're like, oh, I'm just really scared. And I did this with my book. So I experienced a lot of resistance when I started writing my book. I heard those voices in my head, who are you to write this? You don't know what you're talking about. Like, you haven't birthed 4 babies, like all this chatter, right? Came in, or, you've never done this before. Will anybody care about this? All of that came in. And so finally, I just had to turn around and look at it all, like right in the face, and just say, okay, I see you. I hear you. Like, what's this about? And for me, it was like, oh, all of those voices in my head that are resisting this process are really scared that, like, this is a really vulnerable thing for me to like write this book and put it out there. And so really it's just like this part of me that's trying to be protective. And so once I could realize that, I was like, oh, thank you so much, part of me, for like wanting to protect me. And you can be here, and I really appreciate your protection. And I'm going to do this scary thing anyways, And so it's just having to like dance with and navigate that resistance, but you have to know what it is first. If it's just this like murky blob in the corner, like you'll never get it. You'll never get over it,
Yeah, it's kind of like working through some of the sticky stuff. You got to like face it and you work through it versus just shoving it off to the side. I love that you said that. I think it is such a vulnerable thing to write a book. I actually kind of felt like starting this podcast, which is a new thing, was for me quite a bit of vulnerability. And I'm like, I don't know why I've done videos and all this for years now, but I think it's just because it's more raw and real, and I mean, I'm really excited about it because it's so, I'm going to get to help to share other people's stories and just, impact people's lives. So it's neat, but I totally know that feeling. It's really interesting, and it is like, I would say the last year or so, I think we can put this totally in the personal development side, and that's where it comes down to is working on yourself. Sometimes you've got to do a little bit of that before you can do whatever it is you want to do professionally. And as you continue to grow professionally, you also have to continue to grow personally. Otherwise, it's like they go together, right? Do you notice that with the book? Because I'm sure the book, like now at the end of it, because you said you worked on it for a couple of years. Yeah, so I'm sure now you feel like probably almost kind of a whole new person in this whole new level of like not only knowledge, but like confidence and all of that. Do you? Yeah?
Yes, totally. And that's one of the things I work with my clients with too, is like, can we imagine that end line? Like, how do we actually want to feel? How do we want to feel when this book is done? Like, do we want to feel that sense of accomplishment and real, like, wow, I really did something like profound and meaningful that contributes to my life and other people's lives. And I heard you say that too, as you were kind of talking about, getting started with something new, is that we do have that part of us that's like, oh my gosh, this is new and I'm not an expert at it yet. So it feels uncomfortable. And what if I fail? But we also have our service, right? Like, I heard you say, like, I know I'm going to be doing this thing that really offers other people this value. And so what I think that helps to stay anchored in that, it's like, wow, that would be another thing for me when I would get a little bit caught up. I'm like, what am I doing this for? I'm like, I'm doing this to communicate a message and to serve women and men who have just gone through this radical transformation. Like, when I anchored into what I was doing it for, like, that intention really helped anchor me so that I could continue my work and not get stuck in small mind, fear-based stuff, Yeah,
absolutely. I think that very well said. With, your book is, again, I cannot recommend it enough to everyone. And I know that there can be so much that can be held around birth and trauma and all of that. And so and again, it can really, a lot of the writing process that you talk about in the book, I really feel like it can be related to so many different things in life, so many different situations and experiences and all of that. But I can't recommend it enough to everybody because it had me so moved emotionally, and that kind of takes a lot for me sometimes. And I sat down and just really got sucked into it. And I love all the stories that you have. I think we're so moved to hear everybody's, stories. And I felt it very empowering and also, just very moved. So, those, be prepared to, grab a Kleenex, and there'll be tears of happiness and tears of sadness, right? So it's just a very well written book. Obviously, you're an amazing, amazing writer, and the stories that you share are just so moving that I can't recommend it enough. So I'm just so thrilled to get to chat with you.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
So thank you for all your wonderful information. I was like, do I have any other questions? I don't know. Do you have anything else that you would love to add or share, with our listeners? Like, we really kind of talked about that initial kind of getting started of getting rid of maybe some of that fear that's maybe circling you.
Yeah, totally. I lost a minute. I just lost a second of what you said there, but
Sure.
What I would love to add just from what you said, I really appreciate and receive the sweet compliment of this book. And I would also say that it doesn't start that way. Like, it doesn't, like, the way that this book looks now is not how it looked when it started. Like, this is not my first draft,
Right.
that it takes time. And even the stories, so there's 18 stories woven in and out, like men and women all over the country, super diverse collection of stories. Those were all sitting at the back of the book for a long time. Like, I don't really know where they live. And then all of a sudden they dropped in, boop, 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 like right where they belonged. But I didn't know, there was just so much of it that just like happened organically, and it takes a refinement process. There's chapters that are missing, that were there once that I needed to write, but that didn't end up in the final. And so I think it's so important that we illuminate just about writing, but really in life, like our processes. There's so much, especially with like social media, we see the product, we see the flashy finish, but there's a process, and we all have to go through the process, just like we all have to go through the process of birth, whatever that looks like. So I think it's just good to remember that we're all just like working it out,
We're all hanging in there one step at a time,
Yeah.
going through the process.
Figuring it out. Yeah.
Figuring
And so
it
there's
out.
no reason that like if you have a desire to write, whether it's a story of your life or whether it's a book, that you can't absolutely do it. And the first thing to do is just to try to show up.
Show up. I like that.
Yeah.
I love that, actually.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Jamie. So anyone interested in looking more at Jamie's work, I know you also do coaching for helping people to begin writing books, editing, things like that, and also to find your book at your website. And again, we'll put all that stuff in the show notes. And so thank you all so much for joining us today, and thank you so much, Jamie.
Yeah, thank you so much, Erica. It was such a pleasure.